thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along today. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to break off from talking about the Reverend Paul Flowers or the travails of the Royal Bank of Scotland's small and medium-sized enterprise lending arm, to welcome on your behalf Matt D'Ancona and to interview him. And I'm afraid I'm going to come out immediately and say this is a phenomenal book, and I strongly encourage you to load up on copies, and it, I'm sure, make an excellent stocking filler if you've got rather large socks. But what I thought we'd do is just, we will talk for a bit and then we'll throw it open to you guys, and you can kind of wreak horrible damage or whatever lavish praise as you see fit. And let me then start by asking you, Matt, I mean, obviously this is a piece of instant history in a way. You've written it right off the back of the first 3 years of the coalition. We haven't even got to the end of the government yet. Can you just talk a little bit about how it came to be, why you thought now was the right moment, possibly the Rawnsley kind of, book as a possible predecessor?
Well, thanks very much, Jesse, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. And it's a very interesting question, which I continue to ask myself, really. And I suppose
when you've got an answer,
I suppose the truth is, and there's a certain amount of retrospective validation in this. I knew I wanted to write something about the Cameron government, but I didn't want to write a biography. I felt that there was something to be done on the groups involved, because it was such an unusual government. And one of my favourite books in the world is The Structure of Politics on the Accession of George III by Louis Namier, which is a book about the there's no need to...
This is what you get at Policy Exchange, ladies and gentlemen. It's beautiful, published 1929.
Which is all about how politics has to do with groups and factions and elites and so on. And I thought there was something to be said for, if you like, looking at this government in that way, as not just about personalities, they're very important and they come into the book a lot, but also as if you like, a kind of oligarchy composed of different elites. Yes. And that struck me as an interesting way of approaching it. I also thought that, and this is where Andy Coulson's two absolutely superb books on New Labour were, a model. I wouldn't presume to say that my book is as good, but they were certainly a model to aspire to, was that they were history being written in real time, or at least a first draft of history. And I thought that was worth trying, because there's a lot to be said for just going in and catching people while they're doing it and trying to excavate their memories. Although I did find that even medium-term memories were beginning to fade. One of the consequences of living in the Twitterverse is that Twitter has focused people on hourly, let alone daily news cycles. And several times I would say to people, what did you think of the riots or your part in the Libya war? And they would look at me for a bit and think, oh yeah, there was that, wasn't there? And I'd come back the next day, and it was clear that one of the new pressures upon politicians is that I call it the digital acupuncture. And that one of the roles I could perform in this book was to try and just get a sense of where we'd got to and why, and to capture those memories before they disappear entirely, because they are fleeting.
I mean, before they're obliterated.
Before they're obliterated.
The kind of
by
Twitter
the kind of,
chop.
Exactly, yeah.
And is the, because my impression is that you had more access to more or less everyone, and they all sang like canaries in an attempt to shape this piece of history.
I think that
that may not be quite the right.
No, I mean, what's certainly true is that if word gets around that X has spoken, then Y is easier to persuade. Yes. I was very lucky in the access I got. I mean, it was quite comic how some of the people I spoke to. First of all, I decided to do it all on background because it seemed to me too early in the life of the coalition to try that rather stilted on the record interview. It wasn't going to work. So I just said to everyone, it'll all be on background. I will do the transcriptions myself. You have nothing to worry about in terms of confidentiality. But even so, there were really quite senior people who went to elaborate lengths to meet in kind of sawdust pubs, spit and sawdust pubs in the East End, as if they wouldn't stick out. I mean, as tradecraft goes, it wasn't particularly brilliant. But I was lucky in terms of access.
Boris skulking away.
No, one thing...
Hiding, lurking behind
Yeah, I was going to say, one thing Boris rarely does is skulk.
Right, so you obviously... And did you... but there was no point at which you were tempted to burn the contact book altogether and say, sod it, I'm out the whole thing, warts and all.
Well, I hope
it's slightly what Rawnsley did with his first book.
I mean, I hope it is warts and all. And, you know, there are some people who have, you know, without going into details, have been alarmed and cross about what I've written.
Yes.
But I decided, you know, the access this was not a deal. I wasn't entering into a contract here. It was up to me to write the truth. And in fact, you know, the book is in many places really quite critical of individuals and of the structure itself. On the other hand, I make no apology for praising the coalition when I do, because I think that there's an anti-politics mood at the moment, which means that the quickest way to get a round of applause is to slag off everyone and everything. Yes. And there is, you know, it's clear there's some mileage in that, but it wasn't, I didn't feel it was the book I wanted to write.
Because one of the things that comes out, and of course it's been quite widely noted, is and it's hard to describe these, you know, I have to look at them almost as though I don't know any of them myself, but you certainly describe a real sense of tension between George Osborne and Ian Duncan Smith.
Yeah.
And I mean, almost amounting to contempt in places, and that's I would think pretty.
I mean, that was very striking and you know, multi-sourced, shall we say? It was clear that there were several elements to that. One, as ever, a mixture of the personal and the policy. I mean, on the one hand, IDS regarded and regards George, I think, as someone who has had a frictionless rise to the top, and look back on the days when George would advise him on PMQs and put his feet up on the desk, and Cameron, George, Boris, and I think Paul Goodman used to go along and help IDS, and IDS has memories of that which are not wholly favourable. George is, by temperament, someone who...
Do you mean not favourable because they kind of felt like they felt like they owned the roost?
Yes,
even
I mean, I think that he looked at them, and these memories sharpened once the conflict began, that they regarded IDS as someone who was just keeping the seat warm for them. Right. And then in government, George regarded welfare as quite rightly, as an absolutely pivotal part of what the government was doing, and believed from a pretty early point that IDS wasn't up to it intellectually, which is quite a serious charge to lay at a colleague, and to lay at him almost, I mean, not publicly, but certainly to make no attempt to disguise the fact that, you know, that's what you think.
Well, and I would have thought particularly difficult to bear if you've just gone through a whole process of reinventing yourself.
Yes,
and
precisely.
Almost, you know, reposition the whole of the Conservative Party around a better understanding of marginalised.
I think that's exactly so, and I think that where I have great sympathy with IDS on this is that he had expected, given his rehabilitation and his relocation in the Conservative pantheon as a sort of crusader for social change, I think he expected to be brought back in running a inquiry or investigation or something like that. And he was very surprised to be called shortly after formation, hours after formation of the coalition, to would he be interested in the work and pensions job, because Theresa May was moving to the Home Office, and so there was an opening. And he said, as I recounted the book, well, you know, if you're asking me now, the answer is no, but give me time to think. And then went off for a few days' break, and when he came back, the answer was yes. And so his view was, look, you guys wanted me, you guys came for me, you know, you guys wanted to trade on my what you perceive as my sort of moral credit. And now what you're saying, or at least George is saying, is that I'm not up to the job. And it all came out in a very public way in George's announcement that child benefit was going to be taken away from higher tax ratepayers, which had not been agreed with IDS, and was a very muscular way of reminding the Ian that the Chancellor is still boss of huge tranches of policy, and also that child benefit, which IDS had wanted to be taken over by DWP, was still very much a Treasury fiefdom. And,
yes.
And therefore, it couldn't have been more embarrassing and put Duncan Smith into a very difficult position.
Yes, and of course DWP and Treasury continuously arguing.
Have always had.
And therefore,
yes.
That's an overlay. There's a personal overlay.
There's a structural.
It
was a personal overlay on a long-standing structural problem.
Yes.
Which goes down to the level of quite junior officials who simply regard their counterparts in the other department as the enemy. There is a sort of Spurs Arsenal.
Right.
Element between DWP and Treasury. It's one of the fascinating institutional tensions in Whitehall.
We'll have to wait for Appendix B to the paperback edition. That's fascinating. The other thing that comes out very strikingly, just thinking about the kind of big personalities around the table, is that you suggest that the Foreign Secretary loses ground to number 10 after Libya. And it'd be interesting if you just talk a little bit about that, because obviously there was a rather thrilling moment for fans of the Foreign Office after the election when it looked like a very big figure was going to be there, give it its mojo back, and therefore those people will have been slightly disappointed.
Well, I wouldn't want to exaggerate it in the sense that I think one underestimates William Hague at one's peril. He's a really canny operator, and there's a whole counterfactual history where he didn't stand as leader in 1997, and things could have been very different, I think. But nonetheless, what's certainly true is that around the time of the Libyan intervention, George Osborne and Michael Gove were not quite running the show. That would be an exaggeration, but they seized control of the agenda and they captured Cameron's ear on foreign policy. So the two liberal interventionists who were really arguing powerfully and strongly for action to be taken, particularly before the siege of Benghazi, were dominant at that point. And Hague, who was inclined more to the position of the generals and MI6 on this, a more cautious line, was overruled. I think an important element in this, which had not been noted, and I stitched into the account of Libya in the book, is Clegg, who astonished officials at the National Security Council by the fervour of his belief that intervention was correct. There was a general assumption that, given the Lib Dem position on Iraq, he would be almost automatically, if nothing else, tribally against an intervention in Libya, but he wasn't. And one person who was there at a lot of the meetings described him to me as sometimes the most hawkish person in the room, which was very surprising.
Yeah, given the identities of one or two other folks, it's extraordinary.
Yes. Yeah, no, it really.
So his liberalism extends to liberal interventionism.
Yes,
on
absolutely, and a belief that that one of the things that defines Britain in the 21st century must be an ability to make these kind of incursions from time to time. He's the whole Blair Chicago speech doctrine of '99 is not dead.
So because you paint a picture of him as very much, as it were, learning on the job as deputy prime minister, and becoming very politically savvy by the point at which you finished the book.
Well, I think
is that right?
I suppose yes. I mean, savvier anyway.
Savvier,
I think that the joke was that when Clegg entered government, his notion of government was mostly formed by watching The West Wing, and for that reason he made what the Tories regarded as a schoolboy error in seeking to be, as they put it, a co-pilot, because the smart move the Tories thought would be to demand a big department, and they were very surprised that he went for the deputy prime minister, general oversight of political reform role. And I think, in retrospect, perhaps there are senior Lib Dems, including Clegg at moments himself, who think it was a mistake. It was interesting that he moved more of his people into domestic departments in the last reshuffle.
Which do you think, if he'd been angling for a big Department of State? Which do you think he
Well, the problem was
might
that
have got?
the logical one for him to do was the one that he couldn't, under any circumstances, do, which is the Foreign Office.
Yes.
I mean, A, there was no way they could deny that to Hay, given his importance to the Cameron project, and B, his views on Europe were so radically at odds with the majority of vast majority of Tory MPs, that it wasn't a runner. So I think that Cameron would have been quite happy to give him health or even education. I mean, it was interesting that Michael Gove on
Yes.
Mar in the weekend of the coalition negotiations explicitly said he'd be happy to cede his position to a Lib Dem. I mean, he mentioned David Laws, but I think
that's extraordinary in retrospect when you see what
it's
Michael's done.
absolutely,
in
yes,
education. Unbelievable.
yeah. I think at that point as well there was a sense of great convergence. I mean, at that point, it may be impossible to imagine now, but in the very early days of the coalition, there were all sorts of unlikely odd couples. I remember, Gove being very, very keen on Sarah Tether, saying she is absolutely on the same page as me. It's terrific. It's going to be wonderful. That, of course, was not how things panned out at all. But there was a kind of
Didn't know my eyebrows could arch more than
no,
that.
indeed, absolutely. But there was an extraordinary period of light-headed
Yes.
romance about the first weeks of the coalition. It was so unexpected, so unusual, so out of the normal routine that a lot of these alliances formed and, of course, didn't last.
Yes. Of course, one of the reasons why I'm enormously grateful to your book, Matt, is because it completely clears up the mild contretemps that I had with the Deputy Prime Minister on House of Lords reform. And so you say, and you first of all, you do exactly the right thing of reminding the audience, that your readers, that it was AV that was tied to boundary changes and not laws reform. And the second thing you have is some wonderful quotes here, where you say, there's a lovely line, the Lib Dem leader was by now immovable. I can't under any circumstances allow these boundary changes to take place before the election. This is an existential threat.
Yeah.
In other words, it really had nothing to do with, I mean, that was a useful excuse, but these were going to go anyway. About a year or two into the coalition, they'd realized that the mere fact of the unsettling of those boundaries was going to be ruinous.
I think that the failure to get boundary changes through is such an important moment in the history of this government. I mean, I think what I would say on the Cameron side of the house is that I think it was a remarkable failure of whipping and political intelligence that they didn't take seriously the level of opposition to the plan. I mean, it was perfectly clear to anyone who was spending any time around Westminster that this was not confined to want of a better word, the usual suspects, the headbangers. I mean, the people that you were associated with in that were across the party from all intakes and all ideological sides. So what I remain puzzled as to why Cameron believed, as he did till quite late, that it was doable. And indeed the same mistake happened over Syria.
Yes. I mean, there's not sure I'm going to get tempted by that, but while we're on the first topic, I think I mean, one question it raises is how seriously the government took the whip's office. And I wonder if that might have been part of the problem with Syria as well.
It might. I think also that one of the things that any Prime Minister has to do is it's the paradox really of leadership, is you have to be in tremendous command of the detail. And his officials, Cameron's officials, said that one of the things that happened over Libya was that he did get his head around the detail of the mission. He really was hands-on. But you
he's remarkably good at mastering a brief. I mean,
exactly.
That's the other thing that people don't really realise about the
But you also have to be very good at delegating.
Yes.
And I don't think where whipping is concerned that was ever really solved. And then, of course, he puts Andrew Mitchell in the whip's office, and
yes.
we know the rest of that story,
yes.
Which has been live today. And I do think that researching the first 3.5 years of the coalition, it was clear that time and time again, there was either a lack of information being collated in the whip's office or information being fed up from the whip's office, which was not being taken sufficiently seriously. And this was a major and repeated flaw in the way that the government worked.
Because in a way, the whip's office is the kind of liaison.
Yes.
It's the way in which parliamentary opinion is gathered and channeled upwards.
Yes, and I think that the PM certainly saw the whip's office more as a managerial force rather than as a kind of a junction box of information, yes. which led to all sorts of really, unforced errors.
That's it. That's very interesting. Did you think that? I mean, you talked about delegation. Obviously, there are, cases of people very close to the Prime Minister coming in and working with him in Number 10, and you're quite critical of some aspects of that, and also of kind of lack of curiosity about some of those people.
Yes, the obvious example. We're talking about Andy and Andy.
That would be one example. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, obviously the chapter on Andy Coulson had to be very carefully written, and indeed, even now I have to be very careful about what I say because it is.
You can't be too careful. I mean, you can be a little bit careful.
Okay, I will be a little bit careful. I think what's certainly true is that Coulson and Cameron have different memories of what they said to one another when they were discussing Coulson's role in hacking. And there's a wonderful phrase, willful blindness, which I think may apply in this case. Coulson's reputation is now so low. It's important to remember that actually he was very good at his job as communications director. And so I have a measure of sympathy with Cameron actually for wanting to keep him on board. He was really extremely effective. And also he brought an element of he brought elements to the team that hadn't been there. This has always been written up as a kind of class thing, that he was a rough diamond, sort of in jury kind of figure who was billericay, rough diamond geezer amongst all these public school boys. It was much more subtle than that. It was more that having done the job he'd done, he was able to see where the problem areas were, and the trouble was that he was one of them, of course.
That's the one you always miss.
Well, actually, at the end, to be fair to Coulson, he did, before Cameron and co, say, look, I think this is going to get bigger, pre-Millie Dowler, and Cameron said, no, I don't want, I can't let you go yet. And there was a kind of element of tragedy about that, because it was absolutely clear.
He's sending coded messages, and in a way,
he said
having them.
Well, he goes to see. I mean, the incident I describe in the book is that after it became clear that the initial Clive Goodman Glenn Mulcair case was not the only incident, and that the payout to Gordon Taylor became public through The Guardian. Coulson went to see Ed Llewellyn and said, look, I won't have any problem. I just want to do what's right for the government, and if you think that the best thing for me to do is to step aside, I will. Now that in politics is an open invitation to buy the golden carriage clock, but to Coulson's surprise, it wasn't taken, and it continued not to be taken, and he stayed far too long.
Because Coulson did have, of course, this inky fingers. I mean, he understood.
Yes, he did.
The shifting tides of the press and
yes.
of opinion in a way that a BBC person, however good, inevitably
yes.
isn't going to have that same.
And what's forgotten now, conveniently, is he got on extremely well with the Lib Dems in the coalition. Because of the sort of quasi-satanic image that has settled on his shoulders, people forget that he surprised his Lib Dem official colleagues by how easy he was to get on with, and also a lot of senior Lib Dems sought advice from him. Cabinet ministers, including Kuhn and Cable and others, would go to him and say, "What do I do? I've got a problem. Is it handleable? What's the best way to do it?" And I think that it's quite possible I see what Cameron was trying to do, which was, this will go away. At the time, it was just The Guardian versus them. It was written off by lots of people as a media story, And it wasn't until the horror of the Millie Dowler disclosure that the whole thing erupted, quite rightly, into something much bigger.
Yes, yes. Okay, I'm going to open it up in a second to everyone, but there's one final jaw-dropping revelation in this book that I can't ignore. And I have to say it's the only moment where I absolutely gasped as I read it, which is on page 128, Matt, where you reveal that the Prime Minister doesn't actually like Larry the cat.
Yes, this got me...
I couldn't believe that. There was one fixed point in my political universe. It was that, you know, Larry the cat.
This got me into a lot of trouble.
What the hell?
When I was going through the storylines with the people at Penguin, I said, look, you know, this line about the cat may well have some traction. And because I remembered Alistair Campbell saying...
The cat's got legs.
The cat's got legs. The cat's got paws. I remember being told by Alistair Campbell that one of the few times, sort of his top 10 horror moments, was when Humphrey the cat, I think he was called, there was a story saying that Cherie hated Humphrey. Right. And there are a lot of cat lovers out there, and Cherie had to pose with Humphrey. And it was quite obvious they hated each other, and the cat was sort of doing that, and she was doing that. But Alistair said, you know, you've just got to do it. So I can't remember quite why this, whether it was a leak or whether it was a taste or whatever. Anyway, it came out very early, the weekend of the serialization. You know, Cameron hates cat, shocker. And the first thing that happened was my text box and inbox filled with "What's this?" you know, and then there was a senior Tory source on Twitter saying it's nonsense, they get on perfectly well. And then there was a slightly more panicked, proper statement from PMOS, the Prime Minister's official spokesman, saying Cameron and the cat get on absolutely excellently. Right? This is really getting out of hand, right? And then the hours passed. It was leading Sky. John Craig from Sky was going out to the middle of Downing Street with a bowl of milk to give Larry some help. There was a Save Larry campaign. People were phoning in saying they'll take Larry if the Camerons don't like him. And by the end of the evening, the PM himself had gone onto Twitter just to set the record straight. And that tells you so much about both the triviality of politics, but also about the things that can make a difference. Yes. Because, you know, cat lovers, they mean it.
Well, then they started briefing against the cat. I seem to.
Yes, no, there was some briefing against the cat, and of course the complicating factor, which was in a sense the closest that the otherwise pretty united Cameron Osborne axis ever come to the TBGBs, is that Osborne has a very butch cat called Freya, who is very, very, you know, sure of herself and confident, and wanders, in a kind of tremendous metaphor, wanders around Whitehall going into meetings. And so, whereas Larry just sits in the atrium of number 10 on a pile of blankets talking to the cops and muttering, you know, plebs to himself. Freya is to be very active, and so there was this dreadful moment of comparison where you had on the one hand Freya, the Treasury Chancellor's cat, you know, butch and active, right?
Yeah,
whereas you have the sedentary Larry, you know, disliked by the Camerons, and
okay.
A moment of maximum danger.
On which profound and important.
Yes, exactly.
I think we should open it up to the audience. Okay, can I have questions? We'll take them one at a time, and then if there's lots of you, we'll go in clusters. You're all remarkably... Yes, sir.
How is it that the coalition managed to get themselves painted as merchants of austerity when on any kind of economic objective measures they haven't actually delivered any austerity whatsoever?
Before you answer, do we need to repeat questions in order to get it for the podcast, or can we take them as read? Okay, perfect. Fire away.
Well, this is an ongoing row, isn't it, about what constitutes austerity. And my simple answer to it is that I see all the graphs, and I understand the argument that the cuts are not as serious as they could be. But if you are having your... if you're paying bedroom tax, or you're losing a local service, or any of the things that have happened as a consequence of the savings, that's austerity. And it may be, from an economist's point of view, the case that the austerity that is being enacted is not deep enough or fast enough or whatever. But it is, I think, a dangerous road to go down to say the problem with this government is it's not nasty enough, unless you really believe that that fiscal conservatism is not the answer, and that what we really need to do is adopt an entirely different economic model, which is to cut dramatically what the state pays. Now, there's a perfectly... I know it's not your point, but it is a point that is made routinely now, which is that this isn't really austerity, and they're all a bunch of limp-wristed moderates, and they shouldn't claim to be tougher than they are. But it's pretty tough if you're on the receiving end of it. This is what I'm trying to say, is that the right's insistence that this is not austerity is politically, if not economically, illiterate. Because of course, if you're on the receiving end of a cut, it feels like austerity. And if you don't say that, you are saying to people, don't vote for me. You know, the problem this government has, the problem the Tory party has, is that people do not think it is on their side. The way to get on people's side is not to slash taxes and slash spending. And it's a very bitter pill, this, for the right. But the two great institutional creations of the 20th century were the BBC and the NHS. And like it or not in the Tory party, the people of this country like those institutions. They have to get used to it. This is a very complicated political culture we live in. And the Tory party has got itself into a muddle where it thinks that it has become so economically minded that what it wants to do is to go down a route of austerity that is simply not politically tenable. Now, you may argue that the measures that have been enacted by Osborne don't count for much. I don't know.
No, my point would be, actually, they adopted a policy of rational fiscal expansion. There were massive budget deficits, which is the right thing to do.
Well, okay. I mean, all I'm saying is...
They never sold it like that.
You have to, if you believe in candour, you have to believe also in a political discourse and a political rhetoric that matches people's experience. And I would suggest that people are feeling hard up, and they are also feeling that their services are being cut.
But Matt, there's a wider issue, isn't there, which is sitting, I mean, and I'm sure it's in the back of your mind, and quite neatly phrased in a way by Janan Ganesh this morning in the FT, which is the argument between rationalists and impressionists.
Yeah.
You know, are you just telling people, are you trying to win an argument, or are you trying to get people to understand a wider sense of your values and direction and emotion? Isn't that something that...
There is something in that, but I think there's also a... and by the way, I'm not ascribing views to you. I'm sort of talking now in a more general sense. I think that the right has become detached from the reality of lived reality of Britain in 2013. It seems that, contrary to all modern behavioural science, that people are homo economicus, that they act as rational actors, and they think, well, you know, the real problem here is that there's too much public spending, and we need to find a way of getting from A to B as quickly as possible. And that is economically a viable point, but politics is not a branch of economics. So I'm with the impressionists, if you like. I mean, I think that anything else is just an argument to make politics a seminar.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. Let's go to the back, gentleman at the back, then, sir. You can go, and then we'll move it back later if necessary. It's fine.
I've heard Gove saying a couple of times on TV that he's hit his level in terms of where he's at, in terms of politics. I just wonder if you agree with that from what you've heard.
No, I think he's the sky's the limit for Gove. I mean, it's characteristic of him. He's sort of the most polite man in the Western Hemisphere, and self-effacing. But I see nothing beyond him. I think there's a unusual wealth of talent in the Tory party, and some of it's on my right here. You know, it really is a good crop of senior politicians who found themselves in a very odd configuration, where they're in coalition with the Lib Dems, and the most popular Conservative in the country isn't even in Parliament. You know, that's an unusual mixture of factors. But on the specific question of Michael Gove, look, you know, he is one of those people who will say, and mean it when he says it, that he, you know, he's absolutely at the right level. And part of that is because he has a sense of deep mission where education is concerned. I mean, it's not just that he's at the right level, but I think he feels and understands why that he's in the right job. But I see no intrinsic reason at all why he shouldn't rise higher. It's incredibly competitive even to get to that level. It's incredibly competitive to get to be an MP. So one can it's dangerous to make predictions, but is he a leadership contender? Of course he is. And if he was approached by a sufficient number of people in the party, I'm sure he would respond.
If there was a draft, okay, yes.
Yeah, draft
Madam.
Gove.
Sorry. Miss.
So that opens up my question really well. Either you take this the proverbial boss that comes along and hits Cameron, or if the worst comes with external action.
I think it would be a Land Rover, actually.
Would you expect Gove then to get the leadership right?
No, I mean, I don't. I think it would be much broader contest than that. Well, Boris, I mean, this is a crucial point. If the Land Rover stroke bus stroke Jubilee line hit
Route Master. Hit the Prime Minister.
Bike.
We would know.
Suspiciously fast bike hit the Prime Minister. I don't think one can say with any confidence who would take over, because also this close to an election, there's a sort of cluster, as with Michael Howard in 2003, there's a cluster towards the safe pair of hands argument, and who knows who that would be. But if we're talking about after the next election, if the Tories lose the 2015 election and there is a contest, which I assume there would be, my view is that Michael could be easily a contender, but I think the important thing is that whoever wins is either Boris or has beaten Boris. Because the history of the Labour Party between 1994 and 2007, and indeed beyond, is an object lesson. What happens if people don't fight in crucial leadership contests and then a myth arises around them that they should be the leader? It's absolutely essential that Boris is an MP for all sorts of reasons, you know, one of which is that it's really important to have talent in Parliament. But I think that I sense a convergence between Number 10 and City Hall on this, that it's in everyone's interest to have Boris as an MP after 2015, and that would mean that if the party did lose the election, he would certainly be a candidate, as perhaps with Michael, who knows.
Okay.
A very big contest.
We're going to go to this gentleman at the back here, and then I'm broadly speaking going back and forth and front and back, but I did miss this gentleman earlier, so let's get him in. Hello, sir.
We all know the argument, it's the economy stupid, but for this government, it's the deficit stupid. Considering, sir, what the Conservative-led government has done, do you not think there's a lack of Alexander the Great type thinking in the way that it's tackled the means to reduce the deficit? And as was mentioned earlier about IDS and the child benefit cut, let me just throw this in. Would child benefit, cutting it completely, be the domino that would lead to other dominoes falling in place without the agonization over the bedroom tax, the benefit cuts, and every other cut that is planned, and the hard luck stories that it entails?
Well, the dominoes that would fall would be Tory seats. I mean, this idea that, I remember Peter Lilly, who is not a figure of the soggy centre, whenever he was asked to cut $1 billion, said, fine, so which million voters do you want me to take £1,000 a year from? And the room would go quiet then. Which is not an argument for never withdrawing subsidy from people, far from it, but it is an argument to get real politically. And people who argue that cuts are easy aren't being real politically. The idea that just abolishing child benefit would lead, if I understand your argument correctly, correctly, to a kind of benign surge of savings throughout the system, and would avoid other savings, perhaps, which may or may not be the case. Look at the problems that are happening over the bedroom tax. Multiply them by about 1,000, and you get some sense of what would happen if child benefit was taken away. We live in the world as it is, not as we might want it to be. And this is a country that has a very, very large welfare state and a very, very strong sense of public services and the need for public services. And the Tory party has still to come to terms with that. In order to reform that state effectively, it must accept its existence. This is not just an economic argument. I can't stress that enough. And I think that one of the things that this organisation, Policy Exchange, has done brilliantly over the years is to remind people of that yes, Conservatives have to argue for intermediate institutions, and Jesse's writings have shown very brilliantly, I think, that there are ways of being socially beneficial and to offer public services which have nothing to do with state provision, and that is a massive agenda that is as yet still not fully tapped. But I totally understand George Osborne's frustration with the backbenchers who come into his office and tell him that he should be cutting more aggressively, and then come back a month later and complain about the bedroom tax. This is the gap between the seminar room and the surgery. It is the job of politicians to knit the two together. And the answers are not straightforward. So I would caution against believing that there is this kind of magic bullet getting rid of child benefit.
Okay, on my principle of coming back and forth, we'll go to you, sir, and then we'll come back and dwell a bit further on this side, of which there are more people.
You mentioned him earlier, but do you think that Andrew Mitchell said what the Sun alleges that he said? And give us your views on why you think this sort of story has just gone on and on and on, apart from the fact that maybe he's made it go on and on.
Well, actually, I wrote the Sunday after the story broke. I wrote, I suppose, taking my life in my hands, that I was pretty sure he hadn't, and I am as certain as I can that he didn't, simply because I don't believe that that's the sort of person he is. He may have many flaws as a politician, but it's a very it's a socially violent word to use, plebs. It really is. It's not the same as swearing. Swearing is totally unacceptable in the context, and he was right to be reprimanded and to apologise, but to use the P word would have been a very different social crime. And I felt that the party rather lost its nerve in that period, because, and indeed Jeremy Hayward did not do his full duty in investigating what, thanks to Michael Crick, we now know was a fit-up.
You say he couldn't be bothered at one point, literally.
Yes, I mean, his position was that he'd been asked to look into the truth of the allegation that Mitchell had used the word plebs. He couldn't establish that one way or the other. He certainly couldn't prove that he had, and therefore, as far as he was concerned, there was no imminent reason to for Mitchell to go. But what he didn't report was all the amazing stuff that was on the CCTV, which totally disproved the now infamous email from a non-existent tourist. And the reason it's gone on for such a long time is because it's taken us a while to come to terms. I think it was Osborne who said in private afterwards that either one of two dreadful things has happened here. Either a cabinet minister has used the word plebs to apply to a policeman, which is disgraceful, or the police have fitted up a cabinet minister, which is disgraceful. And the truth had to be established, and it's taken an extraordinarily long time, a very expensive and long and drawn-out operation, which is now going to lead to prosecution and disciplinary proceedings. And quite right, too. I mean, I find it a very depressing story, because I think that behind it lies a story of distrust between government and police, which has been a long time in the making and isn't narrowly partisan, but has to be sorted out.
Right, sir, just in the front. Okay, we're going, can we go to the front here and then we'll come back to that gentleman afterwards? Sorry, thanks.
If the right has become detached from political reality, how come UKIP's doing so well?
Well, UKIP is an expression of, it's an angry fist waved at modernity. And it won't take yes for an answer either. Its defining characteristic is that it cannot be appeased. So those in the Tory party who argue that the answer to winning the next election is to do what UKIP voters want misunderstand what animates UKIP voters. UKIP voters are simply unhappy with modern society, and that's a shame, and I'm sorry for them. But I really don't, I think one should be robust about this. I don't think that the entire strategy of the most successful political party in democratic history should be dominated by a group of people who cannot come to terms with the world in which we live. And that this is the world in which we live, and no amount of Farage, vaudeville, and music hall is going to get away from the fact that this is a pluralist world in which there are brown faces in an audience, in which borders are porous, and in which the world in which we live is multi-ethnic, diverse, and people are not ashamed of where they come from and where they're going. And frankly, I don't care where they are in the polls, and I hope Cameron stands up to them, and I believe that if he stood up to them more robustly, he would do better.
Yeah. But why do you think they're doing so well?
Because there is always a reactionary group. It's a definition, and particularly with the coalition, there was always going to be a response from the right. We are going through a period when Europe is in a terrible state, where immigration is an issue. But I don't believe for a minute that UKIP is really about getting out of Europe. UKIP is about stopping the world and getting off. And they're more than welcome to do so, as far as I'm concerned. Bon voyage. But, a party that allows that rabble to dominate its thinking is asking for trouble. It really is. The Tory party is too fearful of it. There is nothing you can do to get UKIP voters back other than do something that would effectively amount to the Conservative Party ceasing to exist as a viable electoral force. And that is the case.
So you remind me of that point where Wittgenstein says that sometimes the solution to a problem is not an argument, but psychotherapy. Okay, madam, at the back, I think. At the very back, was that you? Did you have a hand up?
Oh, me?
Yeah. If you didn't, we can find plenty of others who did.
I just don't think, I haven't found many friends who are going to be voting Conservative at the next election. And I know that UKIP isn't doing very well, but at the same time, they are more popular. And I talk to people all the time, and people who voted Conservative last election, they're not going to vote Conservative the next election. I don't know if anyone else has found that, and I just wondered.
Well, the 2 points are not coterminous. It may well be that there are people who aren't going to vote Conservative next time, but it doesn't necessarily follow that that's simply because they're going to vote UKIP. And I say again, the reasons that they should be voting Conservative are not reasons connected with UKIP. You cannot win a majority in the House of Commons by following a UKIP ticket.
They always say they don't know who they're going to vote for. Right.
Well, that's a different point. And that speaks to the failure, which I completely agree with, that there's been that this government, and particularly the Conservative Party within it, does not have a really high-quality teacher politician. What Thatcher was, and Blair to a lesser extent, was a teacher politician. They were able to explain an agenda and make it understandable to the electorate, and it lacks someone like that.
You've got a very good phrase. You say bad public diplomacy
Yeah.
in the book, which I think is the point.
Yeah.
Is the point of it.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay, I want to come back to the gentleman we missed last time, if that's okay. Then we're going to come over to this lady here. That's okay.
Given that there have been some fairly public splits in the Conservative Party over certain issues, maybe divides and splits, I was wondering what your thoughts might be on Nick Bowles' idea of reviving the National Liberal Party.
Well, I think that, to be honest with you, I don't think it was an idea suggested in the expectation of it happening. It was a kind of kite flying where the kite isn't there. I think the point he was trying to make was actually about the Conservative Party, which is that the Conservative Party still lacks a number of features that will enable people to feel welcome within it. And the idea of a National Liberal Party is as a kind of bridge mechanism for those who aren't quite ready to make the leap to Toryism. But I felt that it was a fascinating speech because, in a sense, it admitted that the party has not modernised, that it is not fully modernised, and it has not yet reached out to voters who don't traditionally vote Conservative. And as a kind of final message to the planet, if you like, Nick said, well, how about this? But it's not something he would have suggested in 2010, or indeed when he was director here.
I mean, it does suggest that the work of politics change is far from completed, and therefore
it will never be completed.
You should be supporting it however possible.
Exactly.
Madam, on the right.
I'd just be interested in your views about how the 2015 election is going to play out. There's a lot of talk at the moment that rarely has an opposition won with such a slim margin in the polls, but we're now in a kind of new era of elections with the coalition.
Well,
UKIP.
I think what's certainly true is that we may be living in a new era in terms of multi-party democracy, the main parties claiming a smaller portion of the vote. We may be shifting from a period where we've had long governments to something which is more akin in connection to the 70s. I think it's on the outcome of the next election. I think it's impossible because what we don't know at this point is the pace of the recovery in 2014. We don't know the outcome of the European elections and how, if UKIP does come top, the Conservative Party will respond. We don't know the outcome of the Scottish referendum. And even if the economy does recover at a more accelerated pace, will people equate what the government is doing? Will they form a linkage in their minds with that and their own very slowly improving standard of living? There is, as Major says in his memoirs, such thing as a voteless recovery. I think that it does rely upon that. It also relies upon the party holding its nerve. And I think the morning after European election results will be the most important one, actually.
Okay, so there's a gentleman here who hasn't been very thank you, kind sir. And then, actually, I'll tell you what, why don't we'll do that and then we'll take three and wind up.
What's your sense from your background discussions with Liberal Democrats as to how they see they'll fare in 2015? And has that developed as time has gone on? Have they become more or less worried?
They're not as worried as they were before the Eastleigh by-election. I think if the Eastleigh by-election had not gone their way, there would have been, well, I know Cable would have made a move against Clegg, and that in turn...
Okay, that's interesting. That's more than you say in the book.
Yeah,
you say Clegg was toast, but you don't say Cable.
No, that's
you know that
data since...
he was ready to go.
He was ready to go. He was ready to move. And,
there you go, ladies and gentlemen, politics change every time.
And didn't on the basis of Eastleigh. And
his birds were armed,
they were
gassed up, ready to go.
Matthew Oakeshott was ready to go, and it would have been terrifying thought. Which would have been a moment of potential catastrophe, because the truth is that the coalition is completely personal. I mean, from apex downwards, it's relationships between individuals, and Cameron Cable would be a very different proposition to Cameron Clegg. It really would. However, that didn't happen in Eastleigh. Vince kept his powder dry, and I think that their conference in Glasgow was, in terms of previous gatherings, I mean, this is on a very low basis, but better than its predecessors. Let's put it no more than that. Now, Clegg privately believes he can still win 20% of the vote. I think that's optimistic. He accepts that he'll lose seats, but his absolute conviction is that his mission as Lib Dem leader has been to take the Liberal Democrats from being a party of protest to being a party of office. Now, the question is, en route, does he lead to take it towards extinction as well? It's an incredibly high-risk strategy. But his view is, red boxes and officers of state are more important than marches against the Iraq War. And that is a very in the kind of Lib Dem brain, in the Lib Dem cerebral cortex, that is a very big division. Actually, it remains a very big division. Is it a campaigning force, or is it a party that aspires in a new age of coalitions to be the anchor for the other two main parties? Totally different positions.
Yes. Okay, 3 quick-fire questions. We're going to go to this gentleman here, and then to the lady here, and then to the gentleman here.
I was wondering if it's the coalition, has it enabled Miliband to clearly have one target, or has it disabled him? Has it made it harder for him to differentiate who he's trying to have a go at when he's critiquing?
And Madam, or Miss.
Hi, a lot of what you said about UKIP reminded me of some of the vein of stuff that Clegg said about UKIP. He always sort of dismisses Michael Fire, Martin Idle, as a colourful character, and says that they don't like what's on TV, and they don't like what modern people do. They just can't get modernity. How do you feel that Clegg has fared? Do you think he doesn't really stand up to them? He kind of sort of undermines them, but he doesn't stand up to them, I think. How do you think that Clegg has fared in the way that he has asserted himself over the UKIPers?
Okay, and Sir.
Yeah. I mean, aren't the Lib Dems basically clutching at straws recently? Everybody knows it's one of the 2 best organised seats. They hold every council seat. If it had gone a week longer, UKIP would have won. And I just wonder what you think the next Lib Dem party conference will be like, because it'll be in the aftermath of the Euro elections where they may well get smashed. They've seen their representation in the Scottish Parliament reduced by 3/4. I mean, they're virtually a negligible force there now. Thank God they're all breathing a sigh of relief that boundary changes haven't gone through, because they lost a lot of their Scottish seats. So I just wonder, you know, if basically the Lib Dem position, I think, is pretty powerless. I just want to comment on that. The second point is more about the Conservative Party's lack of internal self-discipline. I mean, having been an MP myself in the 80s, I mean, I was having supper with all my colleagues, former colleagues last week, and we just thought, we never got away with this. We'd never got away with this. We'd have had the deputy chief whip on the phone to our chairman of our Constituents Association, you know. All hell had broken loose. I mean, I've never known a Prime Minister so publicly disrespected by his own backbenchers as Cameron. And a lot of it, I think, is to do with the fact that the majority of them are first-termers. But, you know, their point about the aftermath of the European elections, I can't see them keeping their cool. I think they'll panic.
Okay, Matt, so fuzzy targets, Clegg versus UKIP, and Tory self-discipline.
Okay, well, on the question of Miliband and fuzzy targets, I think, broadly speaking, it's made life slightly easier for him, because he will be, in his own mind at least, the change candidate on the platform when it comes to the leadership debates, and it means that he is fighting 2 parties as one. He doesn't have to vary. He doesn't have to vary his message. I mean, I think that's how they would see it. They're pretty confident that a large chunk, up to 2 million. This maybe will be a spin. I mean, they claim it's private research. Who knows? Labour is pretty confident 2 million Lib Dem voters have come back to them over tuition fees. We'll see. We'll see. But I think that coalition makes it somewhat easier for the main party outside to then supplant. Now, on the question of UKIP and Lib Dem, that's a very interesting one indeed, because obviously the protest vote that used to be taken by the Lib Dems has now, in many cases, migrated to the to UKIP, and I actually don't think there's much that Clegg can do about that, because why would you, as a protester against the coalition, vote Lib Dem? I mean, the Lib Dems are the junior partners in the government. They have gone from being the protest vote to the absolute opposite of the protest party. They are the party that has acceded to keeping the Conservative Party in government. So their only hope is to, and it is a very, very long shot, is to assemble a new coalition of voters. but they will be competing with the centre ground Labour approach. They'll be competing with Tory moderates. I mean, it's easy to see the Lib Dems being wiped off the map in the next election. I don't think it'll happen, but it's possible. On the question of discipline, yes, it's true, but I think that we live in an era now where authority is almost negligible. It is the starting position is, why am I against this, and why do I disagree with it? I mean, just one point on it is I welcome the fact that Parliament has found its juice again. It went through a long dormancy. And I'm not just saying this because Jesse's here, but I think that the battle over Lord's reform was a really exciting one. It proved that Parliament matters and that we don't actually live in a presidential system. That said, I hope that in the final year of the coalition, there is a self-denying ordinance. The right have got they've got their referendum promise. Some of them still won't accept it, but it's a pretty good promise. And the alternative is a party that won't offer them that. So there are structural reasons why discipline has fallen, but there are sound political arguments for recovering it, if only temporarily.
Labour looks more united.
This is indeed, just final point, that is the thing that the dog that hasn't barked this Parliament is Labour disunity. And I thought by now Labour would be reliably returning to its habits of disunity. And it is true, there are tensions between Balls and Miliband. There's the whole Flowers debacle coming up. But by and large, they've held it together. And that should be alarming the Tories a lot more than some of the other factors we've been discussing.
Okay, that's such a pregnant point. I've got to ask one tiny final question, which is, Alistair Darling saves the Union. Does he then come in to be Chancellor, Shadow Chancellor of the Labour Party?
I don't think so, because I think the one to watch is Alan Johnson. Because he has every, not necessarily a shadow,
a little firecracker at the end
not necessarily as a shadow chancellor.
Yes.
But the way he's been using, I merely offer this as someone who's been on the book festival round recently. The way Alan Johnson has been using book festivals, first of all, to deny all interest or knowledge of leadership, even if not asked about it, but also to burnish Obama style, the myth and legend of his origins. Yes. It's perfectly clear what is on his mind. He had a very rough patch in his life. Shadow Chancellor's brief was not to his taste. His personal life was all over the shop. He, we now know, came very close to having a tilt to the leadership during the coalition negotiations. I think it's not remotely beyond question that if Labour loses, he might reappear as Michael Howard did in 2003. Watch this space. He's the grey-haired man to watch.
On which fascinating and unresolved note, ladies and gentlemen, I would ask you to join me in three things. The first is I want to thank Policy Exchange on your behalf for hosting this event. Thank you very much. The second is I want to encourage you to rush to the back of the stage and load up with copies of this if you haven't already got it. And the third is to ask you to join me in a great Policy Exchange thanks to our wonderful guests tonight. Thank you very much indeed.